Hello, my name is Jacob Itegboje, and this is Pumping Python. In this chapter, I'm going to cover data structures, specifically lists. A list is an object that can hold other objects. Lists are represented with square brackets. They can be created with the list constructor. They can contain any object. They can be changed after creation by performing an operation. This means they are mutable and they can be looped over. Let us create a list. Here's how to create a list. I had a test file called test list.py and start with boilerplate import unit test class test lists unit test of test case class it inherits from, and I had my first test creating a list with the list constructor. So self-assert equal, and I try list 1, 2, 3, and say 0, 1, 2, 3. So I'm trying to create a list of 4 items and say it's equal to none. The terminal responds with an error. It says type error, list expected at most 1 argument but got 4. When I go look at the Python documentation, I see that I'm violating the signature, which is also what's said here. It expects an iterable. I'm going to add the exception to the list of exceptions I encountered so that I can keep track of it. And this one has a type error. Okay, so like I said, from the documentation, it expects an iterable. An easy one is to put parentheses around it to make it a tuple. And now I get an assertion error that 0, 1, 2, 3 in square brackets is not equal to none. Lists are represented with square brackets. I copy that information here, 0, 1, 2, 3, and I'm expecting a passing test. Good. So I now know that I can create a list with the list constructor. It's also represented with square brackets. I like that better. It's less words, so I'll add a test for it. It repeats the same thing, but just for fun, creating a list with square brackets. Self.assert equal, say square bracket 0, 1, 2, 3. We'll do the same thing as doing a list going 0, 1, 2, 3. All right. Just do a little bit of cleanup here so things are easier to read. I know how to create a list. So how do I add items to a list after the list exists? I'm going to add a test for it. Let's say test adding an item to a list. The append method exists for this reason. So I create a list, say 0, 1, 2, 3, self.assert equal. Let's test what the list contains. I name the list a list, and I check it contains the exact thing that I put in it. And then I call append on it. Let's say I want to add 4 to the list. And I test the list again to see what it contains after I call append on it. Does it contain the same number of things? I get a no, I get an assertion error because the lists are different. So after calling a list.append 4, a list now contains an extra element 4. I add that and the test passes. That's how to add an item to a list. Use append. What if I want to remove an item from the list? There is a remove method. Add a test removing an item from a list. Same thing, I create a list, name it a list. I test what's in the list. I know it's not going to change, but just to be thorough. And then I say a list dot remove 2, for instance, and I check the list again. A list, does it contain the same elements or is it different? 2 is missing, I change the result, I just remove 2. So when I call remove and I give it a value, it removes that, or an object, it removes that object from the list. But what if there was more than one occurrence of 2 in the list? How does Python know which item to remove? I'm going to add a test for it. Say test removing an item from a list when multiple exist. I'll create a list that has multiple occurrences of 2. So it's a 0, 2, 1, 2, 3, 2. Which one of them is the remove method going to remove from the list? Say a list 0, 2, 1, 2, 3, 2. So that's what the list is before I call remove, and I say a list of remove like I did before, and then I check again, does the list contain the exact same thing as before it started? We know it's going to remove a 2, but which one does it remove? It removes the first one. So when I give an object to remove from a list, it removes the first occurrence of the list without any extra instructions. All right. I can also remove the last item from a list. There's a method called pop for this very function. Let me add a test for this, removing the last item from a list. So I create a list, so it's got 4 things in it. I say, as I did before, a list to verify that it's got those 4 things in it. That passes, and then I'm going to create a variable this time, say a list dot pop. So when I call pop, it's going to name that value last item, and then I can add a test for it to verify what's in it. Last item, let's say 0, and I get a failing test that says no, it's not 0, it's 3. Change that to 3, and I see that when I call pop, it gives me the last item. Let's see what it did to the list. So I say list, is it still 0, 1, 2, 3? I get a failure, an assertion error, 3 is missing from the list. So when you call pop, it removes the last item on the list and returns it as a value. How can I get a specific item from a list? To view an item in a list, I can provide the position as an index in square brackets to the list. Python uses zero-based indexing, which means the positions of elements start at 0. I can also view items from the right side using negative numbers. Let's add a test so we can demonstrate this. Test getting items in a list. Create a list. This one says first, second, third, fourth. So we've got 4 items in the list. I add my silly test that just confirms what's in the list. So a list has got first, second, third, fourth, 4 elements. And then I try to index it. So I assert equal, say a list, square brackets, and I say 0. What am I expecting? Terminal shows me an error. It's first. So zero-based indexing, the first element is item 0. Self.assert equal, let's see, a list. What is item 2? Item 2 is the third element. Self.assert equal, a list. What is item 1? Item 1 is the second element. Oh, I'm missing that. So here's this second element. Self.assert equal, a list 3. What is the third item in the list? It is the last, so not the third item, sorry. So again, zero-based indexing. Zero is the first element, one is the second element, two is the third element, three is the fourth element, and so on and so forth, depending on the number of elements you have. And if I want to go from the right, I use a negative number. So let's see, a list minus one as the index. I get the last item, which is fourth. So that should equal a list minus three, for instance, and that should give me second. Yes. Say self.assert equal a list minus two, and that gives me third. Self.assert equal a list minus four, and that gives me the first item. So again, if I want to get the items of a list individually, I can index them in square brackets. Python uses zero-based indexing, so zero, first element, one, second element, two, and so on and so forth. If you want to do it from the right side, use negative numbers, minus one, minus two, minus three, and so on and so forth. Now, what happens if I try to index with a number that's outside the size of the list? So if I try to do like 5 as an index or minus 5, I'm going to add a test for that. That's going to create an error. So let's test indexing with number greater than length of list. So we create a list, let's say the same thing. Then before first, second, third, and then I try to index with a number that's bigger than it. So I say 5, that's bigger than the length of numbers. I get an index error, it says list index out of range. I'm going to add that to the list of errors encountered. So index error. Now the unit test case class has a method called self.assert. It's called assert raises. I'm going to add a self.assert raises to catch this error. Self.assert raises. It's actually with context self.assert raises, and then I add index error, and I move this, and that confirms that an index error is raised when I put this, when I put the thing that raises the error under the with context for self.assert raises. You can see more about this in the video on exception handling in tests. I'm going to add a line for doing a negative number that's that's bigger than the length of the list. I get the same error, and I move it on the self.assert raises. That's the index error in a nutshell. Now, if I want to view the attributes and methods of a list, I can do that with the dir keyword. This is also covered in the video on classes. I add a test attributes, define test attributes and methods of a list. Let's say self.assert equal dir list, and I get an error, insertion error. Says the list differ, but this is too much. I can't see the difference. But I also get a recommendation. It says it's 748 characters long. I should set self.maxdiff to not see it. Maxdiff is an attribute in the unit test or test case class that sets the amount of differences that the terminal can show. I'm going to set it to none so that it shows me all the differences. And here are all the attributes and methods of a list. I'm going to copy them to put in my test because I can't, if I sat down here to type it out, we'll be here for a while. And then I'll take out the characters that I do not need. So do that. I say replace, replaces them, and then I indent just to make it look nicer. And then, so here's the list of items and of attributes and methods of a list. Some of them we already know. We covered append. Append adds an item to a list. What does clear do? Does it clear the items in the list? What does copy do? Does it copy the list? What does count do? Does it count them? Does extend the list? And what does it mean to extend one? What does index do? What does insert do? And is it different from append? We know pop removes the last item of a list. We know remove removes the first occurrence of an item in a list. Does reverse give you the list in reverse? Does sort the list, and how does it sort it? These are all things that we can add tests for and read more from the Python documentation. That's it on lists. See you in the next one.